Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have with us Reverend Dr. Galen Carey, Vice President of Government Relations for the National Association of Evangelicals. We have with us Ms. Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine. We also have with us Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, the CEO and co-founder of Skinner Leadership Institute, a public faith and community leader, an author, a lecturer, and an educator. And we also have with us Mr. Rushern Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and University of Maryland professor of public policies. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us. Looking forward to our show today. You know, while anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim sentiments have roots that have basically been partially geopolitical, they also can manifest in ways that threaten the exercise of religion. You know, the Catholic Conference's on Committee of Religious Liberty, which was founded to kind of fight legal threats to the free exercise of religion, is now more concerned about physical threats than some of the threats that may have been to houses of worship. With all of the conflict that we see between Israel and Hamas, and we see a lot of incidents as it relates to boiling tensions that have been elevated as it relates to attacks on synagogues and mosques. At the end of the day, the committee's annual State of Religious Liberty in the United States report said that we have so many instances where individuals who are wearing things that represent their religion or finding themselves going places just to celebrate their houses of worship are finding that injury is coming their way because of hate and other activities going on in our community. You know, Bettina, when I take a look at some of the things that's going on and when you see some of the numbers regarding the attacks that are taking place, there used to be a time where we would look at circumstances and say, listen, there can't be any safer place in the world than a house of worship. There can't be any environment where you could be than among individuals who are celebrating their faith, where we should all be comfortable and feel safe. But it seems that these incidents are now ratcheting up in levels where now you almost have to have full armed security guards just to go to your houses of worship. You know, you've been someone who's seen this from the United States standpoint, also internationally. When you hear this happening and realizing where we are today from a societal standpoint, you know, how is the public supposed to juxtapose what's happening and even understand or even give them a little bit more clarity on what is really going on here?
You're absolutely right, Orland. There's a massive irony because houses of worship are called sanctuaries for a reason. They are expressly created as safe places for people to gather. And it's their very purpose that makes them vulnerable to attack. And they become soft targets for people who are seeking to make a statement and to express their hatred for a particular religious group. And I've talked to leaders of denominations, I've talked to pastors who are intensely concerned about these increasing vulnerabilities to their houses of worship, because every week a large group of people come to worship in either a mosque or a synagogue or a church. There's a predictability to that. And moreover, these places are built in ways that encourage free access. I mean, churches are supposed to welcome the stranger, not frisk the stranger. And that is what makes these houses of worship very vulnerable to expressions of violent hatred.
You know, Dr. William Skinner, when you hear this, how do you view this from the standpoint of you having to advise individuals in houses of worship and advise individuals who are trying to understand how best to understand what's going on? What would be your take on this circumstance?
Well, thank you so much. I come from the tradition of being a follower of Jesus, but I work with people of all faith traditions. And the tradition that I represent as follower of Jesus out of the teachings is that you love your neighbor as yourself, whoever your neighbor is. Now, the reality is that our country has become less and less inclined toward religion. A lot of this happened after COVID, but some of it happened before COVID. And if you look at the Pew Research that shows that 71% of people who inclined to be connected to the Republican Party think that, religion has a good value in society, but 43% of Democrats. But among the 43%, it's African Americans who really have most favorable view and not white Democrats. And so, but both parties have been somewhat, negative about dealing rightfully, lovingly, caringly toward all of the neighbors. Like, for example, in the Congress right now, you have a member who's well known called AOC, who sees religious liberty as bigoted, racist, and attacking the vulnerable, as she supports LGBTQ rights. But you also have Reverend John MacArthur, well-known author and a conservative Republican, who's been quoted in Christian Post as saying he's against religious liberty because it lets all kinds of, as he calls it, strange religions in. So I think that we, as the country becomes less and less tolerant, more divided, you're going to see more and more attacks on religious liberty, and we ought to all be concerned. And certainly for the Black church that has experienced burnings over the years that have not stopped, we definitely have a lot to be concerned about. I think we have to say, what are the tenets of all of our faiths that call us together, and to try to lean in more to that than the negativity that I think is hurting us all. If I attack Jews, then I'm silent about attacks to Jews or to Muslims or other religion, then I think my religion is probably going to be next. I have support religious liberty for all in order for my religion to be able to stand strong.
Galen, when you, in your position, going out representing large groups of religious bodies, and you have to advise them on, how best to kind of allow the political structure to be helpful to you and to be helpful to others. When you see these type of numbers and see the activity that's happening out there, what do you end up telling your colleagues and even those that you represent in your association?
Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that we are part of the problem as people of faith, because we have, along with others, begun talking about others as our enemies, even our fellow citizens. And that kind of discourse contributes to an atmosphere in which violence becomes acceptable. So we need to lead by example in how we show humility and civility in our public engagement. And then we have to, as well, look for ways even to love even those who are disagreeing with us, as that's the teaching of Jesus. That's what we're called to do. And then we have to look for ways to help our people take appropriate precautions. So there, for example, the Homeland Security Department has a grant program that helps congregations who are under threat to make security upgrades. And it doesn't have to be that you go through a metal detector and get frisked. A lot of times it's things that are behind the scenes, just ways of cameras and ways of being more aware of anything that's out of the ordinary. Churches don't want to be places that are off-putting. Churches are places of welcome, so we never want to keep people out, but we do want to keep people safe.
Rushern, you're probably the former county executive of a region that probably has more churches per square mile than maybe any place else in the United States. When you hear this idea about, houses of worship being unsafe, as somebody who's been in an executive position and actually probably had to hear about this from a political standpoint, as well as being someone who's a person of faith, how do you end up managing through that? And from a societal standpoint, what do you see next steps would have to be?
Yeah, just like the rest of the panelists have said, in my time as county executive, we had to increase the number of our off-duty police officers that were at our places of faith throughout this county. And we have some of the largest churches, but we also have some of the smallest. The church that I currently attend maybe has 20 to 60 people on a Sunday, and yet we have our doors locked. So it says where the politics have taken us in this country. If you think about it, the rhetoric at the federal and level has filtered down to the point where it makes discourse about like the Israeli-Hamas war, one that you can't talk about, but you have to go into sides. Same thing with college campuses, both on the left and the right. You hear these extreme views. It's ironic because one of the things that we're called to do as Americans is freedom of religion. That's one of the founding tenets of this country, and yet now those places have become where no matter how large or small your faith place is, you have to have a public safety ministry. That's something no one thought about back in the day. So it really means that we need to get a hold of where we're going as a country and the way we talk at both the federal, state, and local level about differences of views.
So Dr. William Skinner, how do you go about that? I mean, you know, we just among denominations, people view themselves as being separate. And therefore, the idea of trying to be comfortable with somebody of another denomination and then putting ourselves in a position where we should be preaching safety in an area where we thought safety was already innate. I mean, what do we do in a societal issue when we have to fight through these type of things?
I don't think you can legislate bridge building. You cannot legislate a desire to hear the other person you disagree with and realize that nobody has all of the answers. I mean, Galen, Carey, and I, who I dearly love, we have not always agreed on every issue. In fact, we even have come together and talked about racial injustices, and from both the biblical point of view, but our views about it might be a little bit different. But we were able to talk together. I had to hear him and then ask the question, not to tear him down, but I had to hear him to learn from him, and he learned from me. So listening is a skill. Listening is a gift we need to start giving one another. Secondly, I had to stop judging and saying that because he has a different perspective, that there's something wrong with him, that he has to be wrong. And then now we've reached this point where we've started using words like another side is demonic, or that's the all catch-all. Or we're now leveling words like retribution. We're using words that they're loaded for war. And you remember the Sullivan versus New York Times, very classic, for Supreme Court case on First Amendment, said you cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. We're literally shouting fire in a crowded nation. Some people are unhinged enough to take those words seriously. Some of us just use the words and we don't think about it. But there's some people, mental wellness is a major issue, particularly after COVID, when loneliness became a major issue. So not everybody takes those words and says, that's just rhetoric. That's Democratic rhetoric. That's Republican rhetoric. Some people literally take that as a call to action, as January 6th showed us, took those words to action. Some people were in that rally and they said, I've expressed myself. That's my First Amendment expression. Other people knocked down doors and battered guards and policemen. So I think we have to come back to the idea that if we are a nation of diverse people who don't have the same views on everything, and that the more time we spend talking to and not about or against one another, the safer we're all going to be.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word, Dr. William Skinner, but I think you're right on point that we have to go back and ask ourselves the question, who is my neighbor? And once we answer that in an appropriate way, I think all things should hopefully be different. There's a case out there that's called Catholic Charities Bureaus, Inc. versus the State of Wisconsin Labor and Industry Review Commission. This is a case that's been moving around for quite some time, where the Wisconsin Supreme Court just recently decided that a group of nonprofit organizations affiliated with the Catholic Church are not exempt from paying state unemployment insurance tax. It was a very close decision, 4-3, split along what many would call ideological lines. The court's majority, that many have called the liberal majority, have found for the Catholic charity bureaus and its sub-entities cannot avoid paying that tax because they are not, quote unquote, operated primarily for religious purposes. You know, Galen, when I've seen this case that it's moved back and forth in the court system. And on one hand, I kind of understand the concept of there is a separation of church and state where you start seeing taxpayer funds being used, should be utilized for what I would call, quote unquote, non-religious entities. But here you have a religious, quote unquote, entity or an affiliate thereof that seems to be looking to get hold of resources that some would say maybe should not go to religious organizations. But yet and still, this was a very close decision. This is a conversation we've been having for quite some time as to where do you find the line where you start allowing taxpayer funds to be used by a religious organization, I guess, to be doing those things that may be in the best interest of society. You know, how do you kind of look at this case and the decision that's come down so far?
Well, on the question of funding of religious organizations, this is something that's been discussed a lot and pretty well decided at the Supreme Court level. What's at stake here in Wisconsin is more the definition of religion and who gets to decide how a religious group functions. So on the surface level, the Catholic Charities wanted to have its own unemployment insurance program. Nobody's saying that they don't want unemployed people to have benefits, but they had their own plan. And under Wisconsin law, religious groups are allowed to do that. So nobody disputes that the Catholic Church is a religious organization. But what was challenged was whether the Catholic Charities that they had established were operated for religious purposes. And they said, well, they're serving poor people and they're not all Catholic and they're not trying to make them Catholic, so it's not really religious. So what they were doing, the government there is actually saying what it means to be religious, and they're entangling themselves into religious questions. And that's what we see as the real issue here. And it goes far beyond unemployment insurance. It's in any area in which government and church come together or intersect. Does the church have the right to define its own doctrines and then to carry them out? Or can government say, well, sorry, that's not religious, so you don't have your legal rights?
You know, Orlin, Galen is absolutely right here, because last time I checked, judges went to law school, they didn't go to theological seminary. So they are not really qualified to make the decisions that Galen is talking about. You know, why their motivations for engaging in certain activities, they're religious. If the institution says they're religious, their self-assertion is enough to show the religious nature of what they're engaged in. You know, I see this case as part of a larger trend in society, which is moving toward treating religious entities and institutions as no different to secular institutions. There is a large move afoot driven by a certain political agenda to withdraw religious exemptions from religious institutions, be they schools or charities or, you know, even religious houses of worship themselves. There's this argument that why should religion be treated differently in society, be given privileges in society when society itself is becoming more secular? And it's an argument, I think, that we as people of faith need to have a cogent and convincing argument for. I think that's the challenge in front of us.
But Dr. William Skinner, Bettina mentions that judges may not be qualified, but I think because of their position, they have been authorized to actually be able to weigh in on these type of topics because it ends up in the judicial sphere and somebody's got to make the call. But I think the question that we're still kind of like grappling with is, when do you go too far when a religious group is quote unquote engaging in activity and there's a question as to whether or not it's for religious purpose, or should that even be a question?
I think it should be a question. I think the courts have decided, at the lower level, all the way to Supreme Court level, at what point the religious freedom is violated or not. So, to a certain extent, we have to stop thinking that people who are making those decisions are totally secular. They have values too. It is true, I think, as was just stated, the more secular society becomes, and we are becoming more secular than we are religious. Okay, that's a fact. That's studies. That's not just Pew. That's other studies. So I think the question for us is going to be, how do we, as people who value our religion, vote for people who we think have the kinds of character and values who will value religious freedom? I mean, at some point, you're going to have to entrust to the people who are, whether they're at the state or local or federal or Supreme Court level, that they're flawed human beings making those decisions. But I'm going to trust someone who has core values, someone whose values I think are similar to my own. And how do I do that? I have to vote. And I think the idea that people can leave their values at the door is not true. What we want are people who don't lack values, but who are fair in the interpretation of the law in the exercise of their values. No one is valueless. You believe something. You may not even be a person of faith. You believe something. You bring that to all the decisions you make.
Sure.
In Congress or on the court. I think our goal is to really elect or appoint people or vote for people of the highest moral character and moral excellence possible, and to hope that they will be fair in their interpretation of the First Amendment. Because if you look at the most recent cases, they go for and against religious liberty. Whether a child should be getting inoculation and parents don't want it for religious reasons, and the state says no because that's a health issue, or whether a school bus can be used for a church school. Or for the money. There are so many instances where we really do have to allow on the good judgment of good people making those decisions out of good values, core values. We hope values that are similar to ours.
Well, we're sharing what the struggle is you have people who have a secular value. They're driving around jurisdictions where they see these huge religious edifices sitting on hundreds of acres of land. And a lot of them are thinking of, guess what? No taxes being paid here, utilizing resources. Yet and still, they try to create this environment that allows them to, live a different life from us. I mean, I kind of understand the pushback, I mean, how do we juxtapose those two things?
Well, I think striking a balance. I think the panelists are absolutely right. I think, as you said, as somebody who ran a large county, a number of folks would look at these large churches and say, why aren't we taxing them? But at the same time, which we have to be fearful of, even though we're more secular, our politics is still can drive to the other side, where you have evangelicals, especially in the Congress and other places. So it's that balance. In this case, we don't really want the courts deciding what your faith is, but at the same time, we don't want people to go one way or the other. Especially in terms of what we want to see is everyone being able to worship the way they want. And if we're going to have a policy around religious faith, that it applies across the board. And I think that's where, I see the issue coming up, is that how do we strike that balance? And as Dr. Skinner said, how do we do it with individuals who we've entrusted? Because we have to entrust somebody, these elected officials, to make that judgment. And I think that requires all of us to play a role in it.
But Bettina, what troubles me is the idea that I might have a judge trying to tell me whether I am religious or whether I am religious enough or whether my religion that I claim is actually a religion. I mean, if that's where I am, where somebody else gets to decide this and write it down in a quote unquote opinion, it seems like I'm being put in a completely different box I would have never found myself being in.
And you've put your finger right on the problem here, Orlin, because yes, judges have been entrusted to make certain judgments, but they haven't been entrusted to make judgments about what is sufficiently religious or how a religion manifests itself in the public space. The First Amendment makes it perfectly clear that religious entities must be given a level of autonomy simply because they are religious.
Well, I hope that we will see that being put in effect and executed upon, because we're going to be fighting this fight for quite some time when I've got to decide whether or not I think the judge and I agree that I'm religious enough. Rushern Baker, tell me something I don't know.
Well, currently in the U.S. Senate, there's only one African-American female senator. I predict we will have two. And in Prince George's County, who hasn't had a senator from Maryland since 1856, I predict that will be Angela Also Brooks.
Wow. Dr. William Skinner, tell me something I don't know.
Well, I'm going to go to sports. The Washington Commanders changed their name, but not their losing ways. And I predict that they will still not even make the wild card, even with Jaden Daniels, their new quarterback. They won't even get close. And to compare the new quarterback to Lamar Jackson, MVP 2 times, absurd.
You just cut me deep. Galen, tell me something I don't know.
The largest single commitment by a nation to a public health crisis for a single disease was the president's emergency plan for HIV/AIDS relief. It saved 25 million lives. It was just reauthorized for a year, and next year will be authorized for 5.
Wow, unbelievable. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orlin, I love odd facts. Did you know that there is a law in Wisconsin? We've just been talking about Wisconsin. They love their dairy products. It's illegal for restaurants to offer margarine in place of butter unless a customer requests it.
Wow. All of that information was news to me. Good talking to you guys today and enjoyed our program. Thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.